Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's talk in the Great Minds series run by the University of Buckingham. And we truly have a great mind as well as a great brain tonight. Henry Marsh is so celebrated, so well known, and everybody should have had his potted biography. And it's a great honour. Henry, thank you so much for talking to us.
It's a pleasure.
And I'm going to ask, we're going to look at a number of topics, including how you move towards television and then writing. But just going back to your own family, how big an influence were your own parents on your life?
An enormous influence. The older I get, the more I realize I'm completely, more or less, the creation of my parents, who were both remarkable people in their own ways. It's funny, I'm now 70. My father died, my mother died 18 years ago, my father died 14 years ago. And it's only now, they both lived to a good age, that I really would like to meet them and talk to them. You know, I really have so much I want to discuss, which of course I can't.
What would you ask them, and tell us just briefly about their lives?
Well, my mother was German. She came from a Prussian Altmark in Magdeburg, southwest of Berlin. Came from a family of Lutheran pastors and school teachers. She was born in 1917, so lived at a very young age through the hyperinflation and the Depression. Her older sister became a fanatical Nazi. Her younger brother became a Luftwaffe fighter ace in Schlageta 26, which was one of the crack squadrons. My mother somehow just knew the Nazis were wrong from the start and was a sort of conscientious objector. She refused to join the Bund des Deutschen Mädel, the women's equivalent of the Hitler Youth. So she couldn't go to university, which she would have done, which she was a very intelligent, literate person. So she trained as a bookseller, which in Germany, of course, is a very serious profession, and was in digs in the town of Halle, the hometown of Haydn or Handel, can't remember which one. And there she met my father, who was an idealistic Oxford undergraduate, president of the Oxford League of Nations Society, which was a very idealistic thing to be in 1936. And he'd gone to Germany to learn German, and he had no illusions about what was going on with Hitler. And my father was really the first person my mother could speak to about all her unhappiness about the Nazis. And then in 1939, short before the war started, she was denounced to the Halle Gestapo for having anti-Hitler conversations with colleagues at work. And she was then interrogated by the Gestapo all day, who eventually said, well, she was only 19 years old, you're just a stupid girl, you don't know what's good for you, or 21 rather. But she was going to have to appear in court to give evidence in the trial of her two friends. Both of them went to prison. And she reckoned she wouldn't be able to hold up to cross-examination in court. And so to cut a long story short, my father married her so she could get out of Germany. And they married just before the outbreak of war. It was a very happy, successful marriage, but partly because my mother was full of sort of Lutheran German belief in not making a fuss and reserve and hard work, which we think is English, but the Germans are very good at it. But in a sense, their marriage started on the basis of sort of political liberalism. And then my father went on to become one of the earliest of international academic human rights lawyers. They were among the small group of people who founded Amnesty International. When I was a child, I remember going into the chambers of Peter Benenson, the barrister who started it, and sort of licking envelopes for sending out all over the world for Amnesty. So the sort of international work and the belief that my parents are both very sincere but relaxed Christians, which I'm certain have no religious faith. But I inherited from them a very strong sense of public duty. But the trouble now is I feel that being a doctor is a bit of a soft option in many ways, and in many better ways. of trying to help the world than being a doctor. Being a doctor is very easy, I think.
Do we have, we'll come on to that, do children have any option other than to be their parents? And what would you most like to ask your parents if they were here now?
I would like to ask them about their marriage and their relationship, I think.
What about it?
Well, really, how they saw it. Because my mother was very, well, the word obedient sounds wrong, but my father was a very mild man in some ways, but very, very stubborn, very determined. And also, my mother wrote an autobiography about her German childhood with some stuff about her parents and grandparents. My father's background was very interesting as well, but it was all just oral tradition. And he also had a very interesting war. He interrogated, you may have seen that book Soldaten, which was tight scripts of bugged prison cell conversations between German prisoners. Well, my father was involved in all that. He was an MI9, but interrogating high up German officers. And I tell the story in one of my books. His form of interrogation was to befriend people. He said some of the hardened Nazis, it didn't work at all. But there was one U-boat captain who was a bit of an anti-Nazi. So my father dressed him up in a British greatcoat, smuggled him out of the prison camp, and took him on a tourist tour around London in the middle of the Blitz. But
and he didn't escape.
No, he didn't try to escape. There was no chance of escaping. But I mean, the point is, my father was furious when it came out, when the British Army was hooding and interrogating IRA suspects. He said, it doesn't work. It's like waterboarding and the whole Bush nonsense. I think skilled interrogators say a lot of it is about kind of befriending people, but playing on the fact you have a very dominant power over them. So I'd like to talk to him more about that. He was in the Control Commission in Germany for a year after the war, so he saw Germany completely flattened. And one of my biggest regrets in life is I'm the only member of my family, I'm the youngest of four, who doesn't speak German. And, you know, so many people see German history through the lens of Nazism. But what's so extraordinary about German history is that at the turn of the 19th century, it was at the top of everything, you know, science, chemistry, music, philosophy, and its fall was just so extraordinary. So I'd have lots of questions to ask about his family background and also particularly his time after the war when he was in Germany.
So you came to the country, went to the Dragon, Westminster, and then Oxford University College, and you read PPE.
Which means something different nowadays, of course.
Yes,
personal protective equipment.
Yeah.
Yes, it was very much, there was no science in my family at all, because I went through this absolutely identikit upper middle class privileged education in the 1950s and early 60s. I had virtually no science. I think I had science O level as far as I can remember. But I was always interested by it, and I taught myself and read a certain amount. But doing PPE was kind of a natural automatic progression. My father had been an Oxford Don for quite a few years. He'd been a colleague of Harold. Harold Wilson was the economics Don at UNIF. My father was the law Don. And of course, UNIF was Beveridge was there and actually had strong Labour connections at the time and progressive socialism. So it's kind of automatic I'd go do PPE. I always felt I'd rather gone for a soft option by applying to UNIF because it was sort of the family college, although I did get an open scholarship. And I was not happy. I'd taken a double gap year. I'd spent a year in West Africa doing VSO, which I'd liked very much. I haven't been back to Ghana.
Voluntary service overseas.
Yes.
So you were helping out volunteering.
It was still very post-colonial. I mean, they took school leavers to teach. I mean, they dropped that fairly soon afterwards, and I rightly only took graduates. But it was rather like sort of Boy Scouts almost, sending out these very callow, immature school leavers to teach students in the southern Sahara. But I enjoyed it very much. I was living curiously in a Catholic seminary with Catholic priests, which again was an interesting experience. And some of them, the older ones, were very nice. Some of the younger ones were a bit odd. And I went back to Oxford rather reluctantly, was pretty unhappy, then fell stupidly, disastrously in love, because I was very, very immature, with an older woman, a family friend, most embarrassing, and couldn't cope with it and ran away.
How much older? And
about 15 years older, I think. I was 20 at the time, 21. And I ran away, in effect. My parents were obviously shocked, but being the very nice parents were, they said, well, you know, if you want to do that, you'll have to do it. And again, in retrospect, as I say in one of my books, I realized how much of my, in inverted commas, successful career has been due to really partly blind luck and also the kindness of other people. Because completely on spec, the father of a friend of mine, who was a general surgeon in Ashington, a mining town in north of Newcastle, arranged at my request, never having met me, that I had a job as an operating porter, theatre staff. And my muddled thinking behind it was, because I was terribly unhappy, I ought to go and work in a hospital and see real suffering to try to get a grounding in reality and escape my silly, unrequited love. And I was writing lots of very bad poetry, which I'm glad to say I destroyed, thank goodness. But as while there for 6 months, I realized I did want a middle-class career, but one of my own choosing. So it was partly a sort of rebellion against my father. And of course, the irony there is my father was very reasonable. And it's very difficult to rebel against a very reasonable father. But I managed to by running away from Oxford. And then I was very lucky, because even if I said I want to come back, I wanted to go to medical school, but I reckoned I'd be unlikely to get into medical school if I flunked my first degree. So I went back and basically worked very hard and in effect, did a 3-year degree course in 1 year. And on the basis of that, again, very lucky, was able to go to the only medical school in London, the Royal Free, which took graduates without Science A-level. I'd assumed until then I'd have to go to a Polytech, as they were called, and spend 2 years doing Science A-levels. And again, I was very lucky that my father supported me financially. I got one of his nice Inner London Education Authority grants, and my first wife supported me as well. So really, so much of that was largely dependent on other people's support. And I don't really think I deserved it in retrospect.
So the books Do No Harm and Admissions, A Life in Brain Surgery. I hope that everyone looking at this is going to be, if you haven't already read them, I know many people have read what Henry has written. Do read those books, and do, by the way, have questions. Do start sending in questions, please. Would every medic, Henry, be better off studying an arts, humanities, social science degree for a first degree before specialising?
Well, it needn't be humanities, like anything other than medicine. And of course, in America, for various reasons, I've trained a lot of American neurosurgeons in this country, came to work at my department. In America, it's a post-college degree, medical school. And my American trainees, whom are in total almost 70, over 35 years, on the whole, were more mature, were better, and of course they're Americans, so they worked incredibly hard and were incredibly well read compared to our slightly more amateurish English surgeons in some ways. I think it was a huge benefit to me. I'm glad to see that quite a few medical schools in this country now have what are called accelerated graduate entry schemes, where graduates of non-medicine can study medicine. There's a very high dropout rate, I believe, from medical school at the moment in this country. I was talking to the provost of UCH recently, who said they lost track of it. At least 30% of their graduates, they don't know what happened to them. They just disappeared off the radar. And given that it's something we can talk about later, it's really very difficult being a junior doctor now. If you have graduates, I think they're older, it's more of a vocational decision. They're better at organizing themselves. A lot of students, I think, still drift into medicine without really knowing what it's about, or the classic sort of family pressure, the Indian mother syndrome. So it would, of course, be expensive, and American medical students run up enormous debts. But I think on the medical profession would be improved if there were more graduates in it, more postgraduates in it.
So tell us, and by the way, we now have over 1,000 people listening to you, Henry, bigger than in the biggest tent at any literary festival. And of course, they are seeing you right up close. If they were in one of the big tents at Hay or Cheltenham, you would be just a pin prick in the distance. Here they are confronting the real you. The journey into becoming a neurosurgeon, was that clear from day one at the
No, not at all. I mean, when I was a medical student, I found the neurology, the neuroscience, and neurophysiology the most interesting part. And I've never lost my fascination with the brain. Although it's one of those things where, I mean, science to me is like you open a door and you go into another room and you're faced by more doors, and it's infinite. It gets more and more complicated. The more questions, the more answers you provide, the more questions there are. It's a completely opposite process to received religion, where you have your single text and that answers everything. What's so wonderful about science is it's just about asking questions, finding answers, and then there are yet more questions. So I found the neurology and neurosurgery very interesting. I'd gone into medicine in a slightly sort of wild state of mind, saying, when I decided to do it, but I wanted to be a surgeon, so I've always liked using my hands. And again, the sort of drama is dramatic. It appears my anthropological second wife says I'm a classic public school alpha male, and that's a criticism to some extent. But when I actually qualified as a doctor, I got quite depressed because I started doing the primary FRCS exam, working for it, but I didn't really like general surgery very much. Having said that, the two general surgical teachers I had when I was a medical student were inspirational, but as people rather than the actual surgery itself. And it was more or less by accident. After I've already been a doctor for 1.5 years, but I saw a brain operation, a microscopic operation on an aneurysm. And I get more, memory is deceptive, but it was, I think, an epiphanic experience. And I had been looking around trying to decide what to do. And I knew immediately that's what I wanted to do. Obviously, I can't deny the relevance of the fact that a year earlier, my baby son, my first child from my first marriage, had been diagnosed with a brain tumor and had almost died at the age of 3 months. But pretty miraculously survived due to the surgeon at Great Ormond Street, Norman Grant, who operated on him. And that must have influenced me a bit as well. But neurosurgery seemed to answer everything I needed. It was very serious, rather dramatic, technically very demanding and intricate. I like fiddling. I've always loved working down a microscope. And it was just immensely meaningful because it dealt with the brain. And then there was this fundamental mystery of the brain. And I was naive, like most young doctors. What I didn't really realize at that stage was just how, in many ways, it's a terrible specialty because so many of the patients do badly. There are so many problems we can't solve. And for me, the real demands of the work are dealing with the patients and the families. The operating is the easy bit, and the decision-making can be really difficult, really difficult.
And there'll be many of our trainee doctors and young doctors from University of Buckingham Medical School, and hello to all of you looking at this. What advice would you give to young medics thinking about specialising?
Well, I mean, the first point is that I think it's very difficult to get a realistic idea of what a medical specialty is like when you're a medical student. You may have an idée fixe that there's one specialty you want to do. On the whole, when I was still appointing trainees, I was also skeptical of people who said, ever since the age of 12, I wanted to be a brain surgeon, because they don't really understand the reality of the work. So I think you have to, it is said, if you ask senior doctors, specialists, why did you choose the specialty you chose? One of the commonest answers is because there was a particularly inspiring teacher. Now, obviously, there has to be a bit of, not pre-morbid, but a bit of previous tendency if you find a particular teacher and specialty interesting. But having a good teacher is very important, and an enthusiastic person. But you have to really work on the firm as a junior doctor to try to get to grips with what a particular specialty is like. I don't think you can decide. That's one of the disadvantages of the American system, where you have to decide on your specialty as soon as you're out of medical school. The English system, where you traditionally float around a bit, I think is better. Once you've actually decided, I'm often asked, what's the best advice to give to young doctors? I always say, ask for help. It's a sign of strength, not weakness, to realize you're out of your depth. And I can think of many patients who came to harm at my hands when I was a junior doctor, because I was either too proud or too frightened to ask for help, even though, again, the system I trained in was a rather barbaric old NHS, sort of so-called see one, do one tradition, where that's one aspect where the NHS is much better. The degree of supervision now is much more than it was, but it takes much, much longer to train surgeons now than it did 30 years ago.
And do those cases prey on your mind where you could have done more?
Yes, I mean, they pop up out of my subconscious at unpredictable moments, even though I've been retired from full-time work. I retired 5 years ago from full-time work and from part-time work 1 year ago. Yes, I often think about patients I failed. I try to, not deliberately, but just they're always there. I wouldn't say I'm haunted by them, because a long time ago I accepted I get things wrong, but even if I don't get things wrong, patients are going to come to harm. It is one of the things, of course, that differentiates you as a doctor from non-doctors, is you're exposed to a lot of suffering, and you have to learn how to find a balance between being detached from it, but not too detached, and still remaining compassionate. And that's sometimes very difficult. Sometimes one is too detached, other times you get too involved. And I feel very sorry for my colleagues who've been struggling with the COVID, particularly the intensivists and the nurses and doctors, where there's such hard work and so many patients are dying. So it's really, I think, very difficult for them.
In what ways, Henry, did you become better? And in what ways did you lose your special quality over your career?
It's always difficult to pass that judgment on oneself, of course. I think I'm a very emotional, impetuous sort of person, whether it's just because the hormones ease off with age, or whether it's learning, or a bit of both, who knows. But I got a lot better over the years. And I didn't often lose my temper, but sometimes I did. But I got a lot better at controlling myself, postponing difficult decisions if I possibly could. There are very few decisions. I said, but decision-making in medicine is all important, particularly in surgery, particularly in brain surgery, because the risks of surgery are so significant. And I got better at mulling things over, and again, above all, discussing difficult cases with colleagues and saying, I don't know what to do, what do you think? Which is against the grain for all of us, because, patients want to think we know what we're doing. We have to present a confident, confidence-inspiring act to our patients, even though, particularly when we're young doctors, we know we're not that good. So we have to, and of course, there's the evolutionary anthropologist Trivers has said in his wonderful book, Deceit and Self-Deception, the best way of deceiving other people is to deceive ourselves. And I think all of us as young doctors have to deceive our patients to some extent, to pretend we're more confident and competent than we are. And the best way we have of doing that is we deceive ourselves. We develop a bit of cognitive dissonance, hysterical dissociation, as the psychiatrists call it. And fair enough, when you're a young doctor, you have senior doctors above you in theory who are checking on what you do. But once you become a consultant and you're more or less independent, that's sometimes when the ego lets rip. And particularly surgeons, for reasons of self-defense, can become excessively arrogant and complacent and deny, as a way of denying the problems they face.
Tell us about the BBC documentary, Your Life in Their Hands, in 2004.
Well, I was the first surgeon in this country and in Europe, in fact, I think, just about, to start using a well-established technique called awake craniotomy, because the only part of the head which feels pain is the skin and to some extent the meninges, the membrane over the brain. So it's easy to operate under local anesthetic. In fact, in the distant past, a lot of very major brain surgery was done under local anesthetic. But 30 years ago, because of the increasing availability of brain scanning, we were starting to see some brain tumors at very early stages of their evolution, which presented with epilepsy. Until we had lots of brain scanners, if people had a single epileptic fit, they were put on anticonvulsant. Usually nothing was done. If they had a second epileptic fit, they were put on anticonvulsants. And we knew some of these patients, a minority, would present some years later with a brain tumor, which we had not been able to diagnose initially. And we then were faced by a problem in the late 1980s, where patients with single epileptic fits were having brain scans, and we were seeing brain tumors. And the conventional judgment at that time was, it is wrong to operate. These are tumors in the brain itself, rather than outside the brain. It is wrong to operate because surgery is very dangerous, and the patient's perfectly well, apart from epilepsy. And although, yes, they'll probably die from the tumor eventually, that could be many years away. Now, one or two people in America were starting to carry out surgery on these tumors by keeping the patient awake. So you got early warning as you started removing the tumor if you were damaging the brain. Because these tumors, these particular tumors called low-grade gliomas, do not have a clear border. They're not like that. They're like that. And if you have the patient, and at the edge of the tumor looks like the brain, because it is infiltrated brain tissue. So if you have the patient awake, it makes the surgeon braver. You can see the patient is still well. You can set them various tasks to do. I won't go into complicated descriptions. And you can get more of the tumor out. And on the whole, although it's impossible to do any controlled trials, patients live longer if they have most of the tumor removed earlier on. Now, this was a little bit revolutionary at the time in England, and the BBC got to hear of it. They were planning on doing a retread of the 1960s black and white Your Life in Their Hand film, which was in itself revolutionary. At the time, it was the first time surgeons were actually being filmed operating, although it was very much portraying the surgeons as godlike heroes. So they came to see me, the producer, Richard Halsey, came to see me. So I said, look, you know, yes, jolly good, but I don't want to be portrayed as a hero. I don't like that. That's not my sort of medicine. So they made a film. And of course, having a film with somebody with the top of their head off, you know, you see the part of the brain that's talking. And I even had the patients looking at their own brain on a television monitor, because my microscope would be linked to a monitor. It was extraordinary. And the filmmaker made it, Jeffrey Smith, who's remained a good friend ever since, made a very, very good film out of it. So that was how that came about.
And how did that change your career, Henry?
Well, it didn't in terms of, it increased a bit, patients coming to see me with those tumors, but on the other hand, everybody else was starting to do it as well. There was a brief time when I was operating on patients from all over the country, which was very nice, it made me feel very important, but that sort of faded away because it became generally accepted. This was the way to deal with these particular tumors, even though it's rarely curative. But then life just muddled on. I mean, I was, by that, in 2004, I was 54 years old. I'd already gone through a very difficult divorce. I met Kate, my second wife, who's a social anthropologist who wrote a wonderful book called Watching the English. She's super smart and my best critic. She likes to joke, but it was a jolly good thing I became well known when I was already quite old. I would have been quite unbearable if I'd become famous as a young man. I don't think it made a big difference at that time. I'd already been working in Ukraine for many, many years on my own, off my own bat. But it was one of the factors. I was still always writing. I always kept a diary. I was writing a lot already then, but only for myself. So I don't think it made a very big difference to the way I lived. I don't know. You never know what would have been if something hadn't happened.
No, of course.
But it then led to a second film where Jeffrey made a film about my involvement in Ukraine, which again was very successful because he made a very good film. And shortly after that, I then published my first book. So yes, I suppose in one sense I became very well known. But the irony is, I think I became well known for being honest and talking about failure and the difficulties of the work and being very unhappy sometimes. And all the great psychological truths are paradoxical, because to stand up in public, as I have done, and said I make serious mistakes and patients have died or come to terrible harm because of me, you have to be enormously self-confident to do that. And that takes me back to my parents, who I think did instill in me with a very, very deep inner self-confidence.
And why do other doctors not display the same degrees of honesty, and specialists, or do they?
I think most of us suffer greatly when patients come to harm. I know one or two surgeons who have slightly psychopathic tendencies in the sense of lacking empathy and genuinely not seeming to be distressed when patients come to harm. But as far as I can tell, they're very much in a minority, because I know my somewhat confessional first book has been hugely popular with lots and lots of doctors all over the world. And many have written to me or come up to me and said they found it terribly helpful because they'd been through hell over a case which had gone badly. And they found it terribly reassuring to see somebody saying in public, talking about their own problems. It is terribly painful. I mean, it's not the witnessing suffering, because that's something we do all the time at work. It's admitting, it's a sense of shame, because the doctor-patient relationship is all about trust. It's the patient's trust in me, is my trust in the patient. It's a two-way process. And to lose that trust, to feel that trust is gone, is incredibly painful. And then it's very frightening as well. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's so much more difficult for junior doctors now, because doctors now work in a much more critical, hostile atmosphere. Litigation is going up and up and up in this country. There's more and more managerialism, more and more inquests, which of course in many ways is a good thing. When I was a junior doctor, you could make serious mistakes and you basically got away with it. And also you had what was called the firm system. You worked these madly long hours, and there are arguments for and against that. But one of the benefits of the long hours was, you had the firm system. You had the little team of the senior doctor and the junior doctors. You belonged to a family, and most consultants, almost all of them in my experience, were essentially very supportive, and you felt safe and protected. That's something I think most junior doctors now don't have. And I think the job has become a lot more stressful, as far as I can tell.
And Henry's referring there to Do No Harm, Stories of Life, Death and Brain Surgery. And David is asking here, what is the most difficult case, Henry, that you've worked on? And Karen is adding to that and said, could you tell us about a case which you took on when others walked away from?
Well, you've got to bear in mind, I operated on probably tens of thousands of patients over the years. And I don't like this sort of cardinal, first, second, worst, best. There are many difficult cases. What bothers me sometimes is I've probably forgotten I may have genuinely forgotten some of the worst ones. And even now, strange things pop up into my memory out of the blue, which I'd laid to rest. One of the ones, if you talk about what hurt me most, there was a case, I looked after a child for many years who grew into adulthood. And I operated for a sort of benign condition with a limited degree of success. And then the family became really quite good friends. They're not social friends, but we all trusted each other, and they're very nice. And then years later, the man came back to see me with his parents because he was developing strange neurological problems. And the brain scan showed where it operated, and as far as I could tell, nothing that particularly could explain why he was deteriorating and going deaf. And I missed something on the brain scan, which showed a very rare condition called superficial hemochromatosis, superficial hemosiderosis, which actually I'd never heard about before. Needless to say, that very month, there was an article of 3 such cases in the Journal of Neurosurgery, not previously reported. So, no, I was ignorant, but not unreasonably ignorant. And it's an untreatable condition. So, although some strange late after effect to the original surgery. So after I'd retired that Christmas, a letter came from the mother. And I thought, oh, how nice. You know, they've heard I've retired. They want to wish me a happy Christmas. And it was a very polite letter, but they said, no, you missed this. This is now the diagnosis. And we wished you'd seen it on the brain scan. And that was partly because of the expectation of seeing their friend a Christmas card. That really felt like a knife through the heart. And that was all about the loss of trust, the loss of a relationship.
Did that make you better?
Sorry?
Did it make you better?
No, I was already retired by then. So
a better human being, Henry?
Well, I was already fairly humble by then, I think.
Maria is asking, with every case different,
yeah,
and not knowing until you operate,
yeah,
at what point did you reach the point of no return?
One of the most difficult things to do is to stop an operation once you've started. You know, like the proverbial turning an oil tank around. Psychologically, the thought of saying, well, actually, it's best to stop, and then having to go and tell the patient, I'm terribly sorry, I had to abandon the op for whatever reason, is incredibly difficult. I got a bit bad. Occasionally, I managed to do that. But you don't normally warn, it's very unusual. You don't normally warn patients in advance, I may have to abandon the operation. So it's very difficult to know when you reach the point of no return. I can think of 1 or 2 operations. Well, the other case, which was fairly recently, only a few years ago in Ukraine. And admittedly, it was a very difficult, it was a very hard call, as the Americans would call it. It was a patient that a 16-year-old girl who had already been operated on unsuccessfully. She had something had to be done. There were several different ways of doing the operation, or she would die, or there was a benign condition. And I ended up basically doing the wrong operation and getting lost. And that's, to get lost in the brain is not knowing where you are, is terrible. And she was left terribly damaged, permanently. And yet the family were devoted to me and feel I'd done everything possible, and I'm painfully grateful and cannot bear to think that maybe Marsh, the famous surgeon from abroad, had actually got it wrong. I don't quite know. It's one of those cases where actually I can only be wise in retrospect. The decision making at the time was given as a very unusual situation and very difficult. I don't particularly blame myself for getting it wrong. But what I do remember so clearly is realizing after 35, 40 years of experience, I didn't know what was going on, and that was terrible.
What are the main things, Henry, that we have learnt during your career about the brain from the moment you started to now? What are the main things that we don't know, but which you think we might know in the next decade?
I think the main thing we don't know, and this is I'm not a neuroscientist, I read a lot of neuroscience, but neurosurgery is like plumbing as opposed to quantum mechanics of metals. The great mystery about the brain is what neuroscientists call the binding problem. How, if you think about it, it's actually, as Francis Crick said, it's actually very difficult to think about the brain. But mental processes take time. They're physical processes for most of us, unless you're some kind of spiritualist. So the nerve impulse takes milliseconds to travel. It has to travel across distance within the brain, and it takes time. And yet we have this feeling that consciousness is a unitary instant experience, when we know physically and scientifically it's not. And for instance, we know with vision that there are, at least in the rhesus macaque monkey, where you can stick electrodes in the brain, and you can do that to some extent with humans. There are separate visual areas. There's one area for color vision. Many of the people watching us probably have read the story by Oliver Sacks, and the artist who had a stroke affecting the color vision center and saw everything in black and white. Now you might think that you have all these separate color vision centers on movement centers, vertical movement, horizontal movement, this, that, and the other. And then they all combine and feed in to a central, the little famous homunculus. But it doesn't happen. Somehow, these 37 separate visual areas sort of resonate together to produce this single vision. And the same for consciousness. We don't even begin to understand how physical matter generates consciousness. And that is really the most extraordinary, profound mystery. We know more about cosmology and the Big Bang than we do about what's, between our ears.
So the question coming in now, is the brain beautiful to look at?
It is in certain circumstances. If you look at it on the surface of the brain, untouched, down an operating microscope, a living brain, it is very beautiful. You have all the fine sort of filigree network of blood vessels. It glitters in a rather silvery sort of way because of a cerebrospinal fluid. Within the brain itself, it's just like cream cheese, it's just white matter, and it's not interesting at all. Most illustrations of the brain, books and online, are of dead brains, which are actually rather ugly. They're sort of grey and desiccated. And if you're actually handling a preserved brain, they smell of formaldehyde and actually rather revolting. And the idea that this is the very essence of being in the self, is this 1.5 kilograms of dead matter, is very extraordinary. I still find that, in fact, as I get older, I find that thought more and more extraordinary. I'm writing a bit, not very much at the moment. I'm supposed to write another book. I don't know if I will, but I've had my own brain scanned, partly as a research project for a colleague who wants some age-matched controls. And my 70-year-old brain is frightening. It's shrunken. It's got lots of little white spots in it. It's not what it was. It doesn't necessarily predict that I'll get demented. But looking at one's own brain scan is weird, rather like my patients having awake craniotomies, looking at their own brains. At one point, I was operating on the left visual cortex, and the left visual cortex was looking at itself on a computer monitor on the right-hand side of the operating table. And you feel there should be the philosophical equivalent of acoustic feedback. There should be a metaphysical explosion. And there isn't. You just think, well, it's bizarre, it's crazy. We can't even begin to understand this.
Would you be a good patient if someone had to operate on your brain? And is there someone you'd like to do it?
I think I've been a patient for various less serious problems. I'm by nature a coward and quite anxious. I always thought I'd be a terrible patient when I've had problems with retinal detachments and a rather trivial one of a renal stone. I actually found I coped perfectly well. In terms of having a neurosurgical problem, it's an interesting problem because we all hate operating on colleagues because they're members of our own tribe and all our professional self-defenses don't work. And if I had to have a neurosurgical operation, I'd probably try to find a neurosurgeon who didn't know me personally, which would be quite difficult because I've trained so many. But again, you have to take advice, who's a reasonable person. And again, it's also an interesting question when doctors and surgeons themselves, or doctors need treatment. Most of us, we don't necessarily want the most famous or the best person. We want somebody who's sensible, who will make sensible decisions. We're more concerned about being sensible, whatever that means, rather than purely technical, manual, steady hand stuff.
Is there something unique about human intelligence, and will artificial intelligence, is it bound to take over?
I think on the whole, that the history of science is we're less and less unique. It used to be man the tool maker, man's speech, and the more closely you study our closest relatives, are basically bonobos, the more you realize there are very few things we do which are a difference of kind rather than degree. New Caledonian crows can solve remarkably complicated 3-stage logical problems using tools to get food out of a bottle. But obviously, what is, I think, unique to human beings is language and cultural transmission. Everything we do. And what's so fascinating, I was just reading that very nice book by Brigman, the Dutch historian, the Humankind, saying, and I don't agree with his essentialist view whether we're either Rousseau nice or Hobbes bad. No, it all depends on the context and the situation. But it's a very good diagram showing the history of the planet as a calendar for 1 year, starting 4 billion years ago, and human civilization is the last 2 minutes of the day of the 31st of December. And for tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens was wandering around the earth without culture, without cities and buildings. That's really remarkable, and it's still the same brain. So what made that critical change is a bit hard to know. But in communication, some people say teaching is what's critical. We learn from each other. And although there's some learning, there's studies comparing young children to bonobos, where in purely is what we call cognitive thinking tasks. There's no difference between toddlers and chimpanzees. But when it comes to learning, children leave the chimpanzees streets behind, which brings me back, which will be close to your heart as well, which is the overwhelming importance of education, and why, you know, the whole problem with COVID at the moment, and so many children, including my grandchildren, losing out in education strikes me as an appalling cost.
So questions here about, keep the questions coming, everybody. On COVID, have we got too worried about the health consequences and not enough about the economic?
I hate to say that because it makes me sound like an ageist. And although I'm 70, I'm fit for my age. I've probably had the bug, and I haven't been antibody tested. I had an odd episode of nose bleeding and abdominal pain in February, which would count as one of the atypical presentations, and I've been abroad, but I don't know. But I think we are going to pay the younger generation, who are already paying an enormous price in terms of wealth, transfer of wealth in our societies, and even more so with climate change, are now paying an enormous price for reducing the risk of disease in older people, who are the ones at risk. The problem is, of course, some younger people are at serious risk as well, and it's complicated by the BAME question as well. So it's a terrible problem. I'm not critical of the government for having difficulty about when to impose the lockdown and how to ease it off. I'm critical about the way they've presented it all and things like that. We needn't go into too many details. I think it's a terribly difficult problem, and it's still too early to judge. I'm not an epidemiologist, whether the Swedish relaxed lockdown over time will be that much worse than countries with a very successful early lockdown like Portugal and Germany, who, if there's a vaccine, well, then we'll be okay. But if there isn't a vaccine, you know, the disease presumably will continue to work its way through the population. We just don't know.
So we're going to have to live with COVID. It will never go away, and there'll be new viruses. Seemingly,
yes. Seemingly, yeah. I'm not an expert in this field, but it would seem to be the case.
Olivia is asking, back to neurosurgery, yeah. How is technology influencing the way that we do it for those people who you've trained and you've left behind in the field?
Well, the big change in my career was first of all the operative microscope, and secondly is development of what's called interventional radiology, where you can replace open surgery with doing things through blood vessels. And there are various conditions you can treat for that. So paradoxically, the progress in neurosurgery during my career was to make a large part of neurosurgery redundant and unnecessary. I was drawn into neurosurgery by aneurysm surgery, and that took me probably about 15 years to become a reasonably competent aneurysm surgeon. And all that was rendered largely obsolete within a year or two by interventional radiology, which is good for patients, but bad for surgeons. And obviously patients come first. At the moment, there are no big breakthroughs. I mean, I think we're very much at the flatter part of the diminishing returns graph with neurosurgery. There is more sophisticated imaging. That again may make some operations like biopsies unnecessary. You'll be able to establish the nature of a tumor in some cases without operating. There are slightly more sensitive ways of monitoring patients during surgery, but it's ridiculous to predict the future. But at the moment, I don't see any major breakthroughs in terms of making neurosurgery better or safer. Progress in neurosurgery is to make neurosurgery unnecessary.
So that's Louise's question about how you might expect it to be different in 20 years' time. And Lynn is asking how long before technology could be integrated into the human brain, and will it be?
Well, you never know what will happen. Given we understand so little about how the brain works, the idea of plugging SIM chips into your brain, I think, is a long, long way away. There is a lot of interesting work going on with implanted electrodes, and we've all seen videos of people moving a robotic arm controlled by thought. These are paraplegic people. But the point about this is you can only justify the not inconsiderable risks of implanting electrodes into people's brains if they're seriously damaged already, and there's a balance of risk. One of the limitations on neuroscientific research into the brain in future is there's a limit to how much we can experiment on brains, on our own brains. We can't take brains apart in the way you can to some extent with animal brains, and even that vivisection on primates now is rightly, increasingly frowned upon. So I don't see lots of relentless progress. I was rather pleased to see last week's Economist magazine had a supplement saying AI is not all it's cracked up to be, because I wrote an article for the Financial Times at the end of last year, rather saying this, although I'm not an AI specialist, the people, admittedly, some over the top, like Ray Kurzweil, talking about the singularity and computers will be more intelligent than we are. Well, we can't even define what intelligence is. And I don't know any neuroscientists who see in the near future computers being as clever as we are. Obviously, it's possible in theory because the brain is a physical system. But then again, it's to say that the brain is like a computer is a metaphor. There's a very good book written by Matthew Cobb, the zoologist in Manchester, called The Idea of the Brain, A History of Neuroscience. And he writes about this very well. If anybody's interested, they should read it. Saying we describe the brain in metaphors. We always understand things. We are condemned to understand things in terms of things we already understand. And the problem is we've never met the brain before, or our own brain before. So the language is breaking down. And although there's a huge amount of research going on in neuroscience, which I think is wonderful, although I'm skeptical about the European Blue Brain project and a bit skeptical about the connectome as well, I think we're still a long, long way away from machine intelligence getting anywhere near our own.
Martin asked, do you listen to music when you were in the theatre? And is there a case, subsequent question, for preserving the brains of really extraordinary people like Stephen Hawking so that in 300 years we could understand them better?
Well, we went through that with Lenin and Einstein, whose brains were preserved. And that was in the days when people's understanding of the brain was very, very limited. Well, this comes down to the idea of the connectome. The idea of a connectome is if you can provide a complete wiring diagram of the brain, it might help understand it. Now, the problem with that is you can only do that in a dead brain. We're nowhere near producing even a minuscule partial connectome of the human brain. There is a very rough, not down to the individual nerve cell connectome of the mouse, which was published a few months ago. They have now produced a complete connectome for half of the brain of the Drosophila, the fruit fly, which I think has 25 million nerve cells. We have 85 billion nerve cells. So, and even if you could preserve a brain so that all the wiring diagram was preserved, it'd be like looking at a map of a city. A map of a city is only a start to understand how the city functions. With another complete connectome we have is on the humble worm, the C. elegans, which has 307 nerve cells. And after I think about 20 years, people have produced a complete wiring diagram for the C. elegans nervous system. And that's still, they find it very hard to know how it works, because it's a dynamic network, and the network changes, and the same nerve cell can do different things in a different context. So it's very, very complicated. The brain is a constantly changing dynamic system.
Okay, 5 minutes to go. If the brain is so complex, whose intelligence designed the brain?
Well, I'm a complete Darwinian. It evolved as a result of natural selection. Now, there are lots of theories from evolutionary anthropologists as to why human intelligence developed in the way it did. I rather like the one about deception, that we have to trick our way to be successful in life, and it's much more difficult to spot a deception than to deceive. So spotting deception is a strong drive for selection, for natural selection along Darwinian principles.
And an anonymous question: when did you determine was the best time to retire, and why? And another lot of anonymous questions at the moment. Is your best writing ahead of you? And thinking.
Right. I until a few years ago, you had to retire from the NHS at 65, but that in fact was then dropped, and I could have gone on longer. I'd always wanted to go on longer, but I was becoming increasingly frustrated. I was becoming frustrated partly because I had less operating to do, and that was because they'd appointed more and more consultants. I am not an academic. I was primarily operating surgeon. I loved operating, I loved teaching operating, and I was down to 2 days a week, which is still more than many other surgeons, believe it or not. So I was getting a bit bored. I was also increasingly frustrated for many years, I'd worked in a single specialty neurosurgical hospital, which was a luxury. And we then were moved to a big general hospital, and there was more and more management and interference and corporate behavior. That psychologically didn't suit me. So I finally sort of flipped my lid when I was threatened with disciplinary action for wearing a suit to work when I was supposed to be bare from the elbows down. So it was a bit of a temper tantrum in a way, but I don't regret going when I did. And also I went on working abroad, and until the pandemic, I was still working in Ukraine and in Kathmandu. I find retirement difficult because I like to think what I do somehow has some moral meaning. Gardening and furniture making and beekeeping does not have very much moral meaning to me. Telling my oldest granddaughter fairy stories on FaceTime probably is the most useful thing I'm doing at the moment. In terms of writing, it was easy. The other two books were easy to write because I was just describing my day-to-day life. The stories just arrived. I made a storytelling. I started trying to write a more sort of philosophical book about the brain, but I got bored by that. I'm now writing again, but mainly about the pandemic and my response to it, and thoughts about retirement and death and things like that, but purely for myself. Whether it will be publishable or not, I just don't know, but I'm just writing for myself.
Time for two very quick questions. One, here, you talked there about carpentry, working with wood. Last week we had fellow Oxford resident Philip Pullman.
Oh yeah, I know Philip quite well. Yeah,
talking about his own work with his hands.
We swapped photographs of things we've made. Yes.
So what is it? Should we all be doing this?
I think practical work with the hands is immensely therapeutic, beneficial. I think everybody. I didn't really enjoy it at school. It's something I really started teaching myself, woodwork, when I was a medical student. But I always liked using my hands. Now, whether some of that's innate, it probably isn't. My father, who was a bit of a bodger, liked doing things. And I think it's a huge, a huge benefit and privilege if you can do things. Anything, stained glass, drawing, whatever. And I think all children ought to be encouraged from an early age to have some practical skills like that.
Absolutely right. And the last question, you're very open-minded about many things, but with religion, you say very clearly you are irreligious. You don't believe. is there any possibility that you might believe that people have a soul?
Very unlikely, unless a large part of my brain is destroyed by a stroke, the largely skeptical, rational part. As I said, how our brain cells generate conscious experience is a complete mystery. But for me, I've seen so many people with brain damage where their personality and what made them good people was irrevocably changed by brain damage. For me, the fact that thought is a physical process is inescapable, and when we die, our brains die. I'm a bit of a pantheist, though. I mean, I don't, as I said, I don't know. I think animals, I'm sure I don't know. It seems to be very probable animals of consciousness, though we can't imagine what it's like. I doubt it. I know stuff about the wood wide web. I doubt if trees are conscious. But I think, in that sense, I'm an agnostic. I do have a deep sense of love of life and love of fellow creatures. I think that looking back on our time, other than global warming, the way we've treated animals over the years will look as egregious as we now look back on slavery and what Europeans did to the rest of the world from the 18th century onwards.
Very moving and profound thoughts there, Henry, with which to finish this. Thank you very, very much from us all. That was profoundly stimulating and moving. Thank you to the 1,000+ listening in. And join us later this week. Henry Marsh, thank you for the utter privilege.
No problem at all. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.